that adversity does not always lead to good things. There's a key ingredient, and that is that people need to get through the adversity without feeling crushed by it. If somebody feels that something is more than they're able to resiliently manage, they're not going to grow from it, unfortunately. So Nietzsche's famous aphorism, "What doesn't kill me makes me stronger," is half true. That's only true if you get through it successfully.
Dr. Daniel Lieberman, I'm excited to dive into your story. And I want to start when you went to St. John's. They took a different approach to learning that I think is really aspirational, to say the least, because I think it's a different way that a lot of people aren't used to learning, but also it helped you learn in a different way that I think is really cool. What was it about the way that they taught that inspired you to get into the work that you got into today?
Well, St. John's is a strange school. In some ways, its approach to education is revolutionary, and in some ways, it is ancient.
Hmm.
Um, there are no textbooks, there are no lectures, there are no exams at St. John's. Everybody reads the great books. These are the books that have had the greatest influence on Western civilization, going all the way back to Homer with the Odyssey and the Iliad, Socrates, Aristotle, working our way up through the medieval period, the Renaissance to the modern period, just reading original sources and discussing them in small groups. And so it really exposes you to the most important ideas in Western civilization. You grapple with them in the original language, which can be challenging. And it's a great way to learn critical thinking and just the basis of reasonable discourse. So I went through this reading the most important works, and it was so inspiring to me that I felt like the most important thing in the universe is the human mind. And I decided that's what I wanted to study in my career.
I'm right with you on that. I decided not to go to college, but I like to learn from you and people that are doing it at the highest level. So I don't have to go that way. But I hope that I can be able to ask the right questions to help other people learn about it as well. Because I think a lot of people are unaware of how the mind even works to begin with. You dove a little bit into that with Spellbound. But I want to dive into the molecule more as well. But before we even jump into any of that, I know Carl Jung was a big impact on you as well as Socrates and everything else. What was it? Do you remember a piece of knowledge or ideology that he lived by that kind of inspired you to dive deeper?
Yeah, I think that for me, he was the one who really opened up the idea that the human mind is so much more than what we are aware of. Sigmund Freud is best known for his work with the unconscious mind, but Sigmund Freud took a very, very narrow view. To him, the unconscious mind was in some ways the worst of what's in human beings, and it was very much focused on the reproductive instinct, sex. Carl Jung took a much broader view, and by studying ancient stories of the supernatural, myths, fairy tales, stories about gods and goddesses, he realized that these were actually metaphors for many, many instinctual forces within the unconscious mind that go far beyond sex. And when you look at it that way, it brings an incredible richness to understanding the human mind.
What about the mystical side of things have you always been curious about? Because I know that that was a big part of writing Spellbound to begin with. I think it came from a different lens, psychiatrist, and then diving into a completely a different way of looking at all of the work that you do. Where do you think people misunderstand that work in itself?
Let's see, that's a tough question. So let's just talk about mystical things to start with. Um, as a guy in tech, when I was a kid, of course, I was one of those geeks who read fantasy novels
Mhm.
um, like crazy when I was a kid. And I just loved the stories about magic and mysticism. And one of the things that I noticed as I read these different books, going from author to author, that there seemed to be a commonality in the magic. And that puzzled me because I knew that magic wasn't real. I knew that it was something that people were making up. How was it that they were all making up the same ideas?
Yeah.
And I began to suspect that maybe there was something deeper underneath that. And later in life, what I learned is that they were all drawing off of the same magical traditions that go back millennia to the ancients. And not only that, but if you look at different cultures from ages ago, cultures that did not have any communication between them that we know of. Again, you see the same things in their mystical traditions. And the way Carl Jung explained that is he said, all human beings share a common anatomy. We got 2 lungs, 1 liver, 1 pancreas, 2 eyes, a nose, etc. It would make sense that we would all share a common psychological bedrock. And this is the source of those mythological themes that keep popping up everywhere in the ancient world and also in the modern world in these stories about the supernatural.
So is there a surprising piece of knowledge or something like what is the continuum of that, if that makes sense? Like where does that show up?
So I think that what's most surprising about it is just how powerful it is
Yeah.
and the intensity it has in terms of its influence over our lives. In the modern world, we focus on rationality, and rationality is miraculous and amazing. Rationality is what has given us modern technology, modern medicine, all the comforts of modern life. It's what's made humankind the masters of the earth. But I think that rationality has given us so much that we appreciate so much. We've become enamored with it, and we've lost sight of the other side of human nature. And that is irrationality, things like desire and emotion and passions. And as rational as we may think that we are, those irrational instincts can overwhelm us at a moment's notice. And we say things like, oh my gosh, I don't know what got into that person, got into them, as if they're somehow being possessed by some outside force. Or we see people who are very, very intelligent, very successful, and through one incomprehensible bad decision, they completely ruin their lives. So we need to be respectful of these irrational forces within us, because if we're not aware of them, if we're not able to work with them productively, they will ambush us. And sometimes that can have devastating consequences.
Yeah, the unconscious, as you like to say it, it's not just the subconscious, but the unconscious, a different way of looking at it. I think a lot of people are unaware of the role that it plays in our lives, but as you said, and I've dove into it a little bit more in your work, that a lot of the jealousy or hatred or any of the really negative emotions we like to suppress come from our unconscious. It's not like we really have a choice to like have them show up in our lives. So how can we almost I know when you were writing The Molecule of More, that's when meditation really came into your life, but is there anything else that has allowed you to be more grounded and not take more control over that unconscious? Because of course, again, as I just said, we don't really have the control over it, but almost build a better relationship with it.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the cultivation of something that psychiatrists call the observing ego is
Mhm.
helpful. And what that means in some ways is to take a step back from what's going on in your brain and observe it and accept it without necessarily identifying with it. So,
Mhm.
for example, if I'm driving and somebody cuts me off, I don't like that. I'm not good behind the wheel when it comes to controlling my emotions. Somebody cuts me off, and maybe to add insult to injury, they reach out the window and give me the finger. I'm going to feel angry.
Mhm.
And I can do one of two things with that anger. I can identify with it. I can say, this is me. I'm angry. I'm furious. I need to act on this to express myself. Or I can say, this is emotion I'm experiencing. And I have a choice what to do with it. The worst thing to do with it is to disavow it, to say, this is a bad emotion. I'm a good person. I'm going to pretend I didn't have it. I'm going to suppress it. The problem with that is that when you push it down into the unconscious by pushing it out of consciousness, it becomes autonomous. And that's why sometimes we may do things that are completely uncharacteristic of who we think we are, because we've pushed away the negative aspects of ourselves. The best thing to do is to accept it and say, this is part of me. It's not part of me I like, but there's lots of parts of me, physical and psychological, that I don't like. I can choose what I'm going to do with this. I can choose to act on it. I can choose to not act on it. But what I shouldn't choose to do is to try to not experience it.
Mhm.
So the observing ego allows you to fully experience both the positive and the negative without identifying with it. It's taking that one step back.
I think the idea of not identifying with your thoughts, your the way that you feel about yourself, all of it has such a massive role. Working with clients daily basis, a lot, I would assume frequently, how do you help people stop identifying with their idea of themselves? Because the emphasis of this podcast really is to kind of break down people's stories and the works that they put into the world to help other people really unlearn the things that they need to unlearn. And the core of that is our idea of ourself, which holds so many of us back. So how do you almost help people detach from who they think they are so that they can create a better life stepping into who they desire to be, really?
Yeah. So one thing I'd like to point out is that I think that the way Carl Jung understood psychology is an absolutely wonderful way for healthy people to grow.
Mm,
I don't think it's a good way to help people suffering from mental illnesses get back to a healthy place. And the reason is that the kinds of things that Jung was writing about um, were very powerful, potentially very dangerous forces. And so when we start to open up the gateway between the conscious and the unconscious, frightening things can come through. And you want to make sure that you have the strength of your conscious mind to be able to handle those wild instinctual animals that are part of the human condition. And you mentioned meditation. Maybe we can talk more about that later. That's one way to strengthen the mind and be ready for this onslaught. So I'm not going to do this kind of work with people who are in crisis or who are struggling. But for people who've gotten to a healthy place and they are ready for the painful experience which growth represents, the first step is to really try to come to terms, try to almost make friends with the parts of yourself that you've been pushing away. And that means that just try to, you want to make friends. You can't control these things and you want to make friends with them. So if you want to make friends with another person, where do you start? Well, the most powerful thing you can do is to listen. And listening sounds very simple, but it's actually extremely difficult. Often when we're having a conversation with someone else, we're not really giving them 100% of our attention. We're maybe thinking about what we want to say next. Maybe we're even thinking about what we're going to make for dinner or what's going on at work. But if you do give someone 100% of your attention, it has a very powerful influence on the relationship. Charismatic people know this. And charismatic people are often described as making you feel like you're the only person in the room because they're giving you that 100% attention and it's a powerful experience. So if you want to make friends with these more bestial, instinctual forces within you, the first step is to just listen. Pay attention to the emotions that come up. Pay attention to spontaneous ideas. When we think of thought, we often think of voluntariness. I'm going to think about this report I have to write, or I'm going to think about what I'm going to buy at the store. In fact, the vast majority of thoughts that we have are not chosen. They just pop into our mind. Sometimes we'll follow up on those thoughts. Other times we'll ignore them. I would say try to pay a little bit more attention and be curious. Ask yourself, why did I just have that thought? Why did that pop into my mind? I haven't thought about that in years and years and years. Why now? So the first step in forging this powerful, good relationship with the unconscious is listening, getting to know who it is.
I think it's so powerful, especially in conversation like this. It's a practice I continue to continuously try to build is the power of listening through coaching and so many other realms. It is a challenge that every single one of us has because we just want to be heard rather than like hearing someone else speak, which is so powerful. I think the idea of listening to yourself is where meditation comes in, right? And I'd love to. I think you call it. Is it mental time travel that you call it?
Yeah, that's one thing we've talked. Yeah, yeah.
One because I want to break down the differences because I think for a lot of people meditation is almost visualization, whether it's the person that they want to become, a goal that they want to achieve, and then there's also the meditation, transcendental meditation, when you're just sitting with your thoughts and you're listening to them. You're not identifying with them, but as you said, you're being curious about them. You're allowing them to show up without judging them or judging yourself, which is such a difficult thing for people to do. How do you see the differences between the two? Because I love the mental time travel. It's something I definitely practice a lot.
So, Mental time travel is something that in some ways is unique to human beings.
Mm.
It allows us to work with things that don't yet exist, hypotheticals. And this is something that the rational conscious mind is very good at. So for example, if I want to go from DC to New York City, I could fly, I could take the bus, I could take the train. To decide which one I'm going to do, I project myself into the future. And I imagine myself going through security at the airport or on a bus ride or on a train. And I get a feel for what's best. Meditation, on the other hand, is very much being in the present moment. And it's a very different experience. It's a more difficult experience. It's a less comfortable experience because when we're dealing with abstractions that don't exist, we have so much control over that. It's almost like a fantasy. We can think about this, we can think about that, we can solve this problem, solve that problem. When we're in the present moment, we're powerless. Nothing can be changed about the present. Only the future can be changed. And so all we can do is accept. And human beings don't like that. That's scary. We like to feel like we have some control. And so just pure acceptance is difficult.
Yeah, the idea of like worry is like our idea that because we're worrying about something in the future, that's giving us a false sense of certainty that we have control over what's going to happen.
Yes,
And
yes.
it just doesn't work that way. One thing that I've heard you say, and I'm going to bring up a lot of quotes throughout this because there's a lot of quotes I've heard you say that I love, and I think a lot of people struggle with. The first one is the guy that is most able to afford the beach house is the least likely to enjoy it. That's the same person that is always thinking about the next thing that they want to pursue, the next goal that they want to achieve. Dopamine is the thing that we think is a pleasure molecule, but it's really, as you said, like the Winnie the Pooh kind of perspective, which I'd love for you to break that down too, is that we think that it's the achievement in itself, but really the anticipation is what we're looking for, what really gives us that dopamine. So, how can we use dopamine almost to our advantage rather than letting it control us? Because that's something every one of us has to struggle with.
So, as you mentioned, when most people think about dopamine, the first thing they think about is pleasure. But dopamine gives you a very specific kind of pleasure. It gives you pleasure when you feel like your future is about to get better,
Mm,
more secure, more resource rich. So, for example, if you win a competition, if you inherit a large sum of money, if you get a raise, these are all dopaminergic pleasures which lead to excitement, enthusiasm, maybe feelings of confidence. It's future oriented, but there's another class of pleasures that is not dopamine, and that's present oriented. So, for example, pleasures of the senses, smelling a flower, someone stroking your skin gently, pleasures of relationship, just the joy of being with another person. These pleasures don't have anything to do with the future. They're about right here, right now. And so dopamine is not involved. And subjectively, they feel very different. You don't have the excitement and enthusiasm of dopamine. What you have is fulfillment and satisfaction brought about by other brain chemicals such as oxytocin, endorphin, endocannabinoid. So dopamine is about the future. It's about anticipation. And the Winnie the Pooh that quote that you bring up
right.
is a great one. We don't expect to find neuroscientific insight in children's books. But one day, Christopher Robin asked Winnie the Pooh, "What's your favorite thing in the world?" Winnie the Pooh, of course, is about to say eating honey, but then he remembers there's a moment just before you start to eat honey, which is even better, but he didn't know what it was called. And it's called dopamine. Dopamine rewards us for what's about to happen. It's always about the future, not the present. So if somebody has a lot of dopamine, very active dopamine system, they're going to be very future oriented. That can manifest in different ways. One way it can manifest is as the workaholic who's always working, working, working for the future. Everybody else is at home having dinner with their friends, maybe their family. They're relaxing, they're enjoying. This workaholic is still at work, laboring away for the future. So this is the person who's going to be able to afford that $1 million beach house, but he's going to be completely unable to enjoy it. He's going to be on the beach. He's going to have his laptop out, working, 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 completely unaware of all the beautiful things around him.
It is such a difficult battle because we see that achievement is where our happiness comes from. And we see achievement is where our pride, our joy, our fulfillment, everything in life that we feel like we want comes from that. One thing that I took from Tim Ferriss that he does is he'll put a vacation out a year or two in the future just so he can be excited about the anticipation of it, so that he like the enjoyment of the vacation isn't just a vacation, but it's the anticipation of it. And I think it's so important to think of this in life because we feel that, say you want a dream car and you achieve it at 25 instead of achieving it at 45. Well, then you have to find a different goal to move towards. You have to, it's just not as exciting as you thought it would be because it comes a lot quicker. So when we are going to set goals, for example, how can we use dopamine to our advantage when it comes to setting goals or moving towards pursuits in life?
Aristotle said that ultimately everything we do is for the sake of happiness,
Mhm.
right? So why do I get up in the morning? Well, so I'm not going to be late for work. Why do I go to work? Well, for money. It goes on forever. Why do you need money to pay the bills? But but it ends at happiness, right? Why do you pay the bills? Well, so I won't have the electricity shut off and for my happiness. And I'd like to take issue with the statement achievement is what gives us happiness.
Mhm.
Achievement is what satisfies the evolutionary imperative of staying alive and reproducing. And that evolutionary imperative has a pretty profound influence on our brains and subsequently our behavior. But that's not the same thing as happiness. Um, we see very, very successful people out there, entrepreneurs, celebrities, and we may envy them and we think, wow, I'd like to be like them. But when you read interviews, the achievement doesn't make them happy. Sometimes just the opposite. We were fortunate enough to have a number of celebrities respond to Molecule of More, and this is what they said. Miley Cyrus, in fact, talked about being on stage in front of thousands of adoring fans and feeling nothing and saying to herself, I wonder what it's like to be a doctor and save somebody's life. Grass is always greener on the other side. And we always think if I can just achieve this next level, I'll be happy. When I was struggling to climb up the academic ladder, uh, assistant professor, associate professor, full professor, I said, if I can just get to the end, if I can just become a full professor, I'll feel good about myself and I will be happy. And it's never true. You say, if I can just make this much money, and it's never true. It's always the next thing. So, what is it that really gives us happiness? Well, have you ever had an experience in your life that made you think, oh my God, I feel so alive?
Absolutely.
That's happiness. That's what we really want. We want the feeling of being alive. And it's tricky. It very much involves the unconscious mind because you might be out with some friends and have a great time and say, "Oh my God, that was the best time ever. Let's do that again next weekend." And it doesn't. It's not the same. And one of Jung's students, um, talking about this in terms of fairy tales, said the water of life is never found in the same place twice. So we can set goals, we can work for achievements, but we should not deceive ourselves that this is going to lead to happiness and satisfaction. Happiness and satisfaction are much less predictable. We can do things that increase our capacity for happiness and satisfaction, but like the unconscious mind, we can't snap our fingers and give orders. We have to live our life in a certain way and wait for it to come as a gift rather than something that we are entitled to.
Yeah, that paradox of how can I be content while also achieving my goals, I think is the question that everyone asks at all
Yeah.
times of life.
Yeah.
And that question and it's the answer is within the question in itself, right? And I think that recognizing that there's no achievement that's going to make you more fulfilled, then if you're not happy where you are now, it's like you're not going to be happy wherever you're trying to get to. There's a question that you often ask yourself is that is this a dopamine moment or a here and now moment? And I'm a person that I absolutely love questions. It's the reason that I have this podcast. I want to ask better questions to you and to myself as well. What are other questions that you ask yourself that keep you grounded?
Yeah. So, I try to pay attention to things that are outside my conscious control.
Mhm.
Spontaneous thoughts, desires, emotions. And I like to ask myself, where's this coming from? The conscious mind is sort of unitary. We feel that we are one single person.
Right.
The unconscious mind is not like that at all. There are lots and lots and lots of different forces in there that sometimes compete and sometimes cooperate. Just simple example, I feel like having a donut. That desire is not a conscious choice. It just
Mhm.
comes up. I feel like having it. If I eat a donut, I'm going to feel guilty. Feeling guilty is not a conscious choice. It just comes up. So we've got these two unconscious forces that are in conflict with one another.
Mhm.
And really, there's dozens and dozens of them. Carl Jung spoke about personifying them as characters as the best way to understand them. Um, and so when I'm having these mental experiences outside of my control, I try to ask myself, what agent in the unconscious mind is responsible for this?
Mhm.
Why is it hitting me with this? And what's the best way to manage it?
That's powerful. So when we because it's both of your books, it's funny how they intertwine in such a way where the dopamine is like we have this drive to achieve, and then we have the unconscious recognizing that we don't really control what we want to achieve. So it's such a battle that we don't really control what our desires are, but our dopamine system is what pushes us to desire. I know that our genes have a massive impact on our dopamine. So say that we have a um, we really lean towards being more towards the dopamine kind of things that we want to achieve, phones, whatever it may be. How can we, I want to say, gain a little bit more control? Because I know you don't believe in dopamine detox. So break that down a little bit, how we can build a better relationship.
Yeah. So, our behavior, our experiences generally come about as a combination between our genes, very big
Mhm.
influence there. Our early experiences in life, if you think of a little sapling, little tree, if it's bent when it's little, as an adult, as a full grown tree, it's going to end up bent. Um, and so those experiences early on with our primary caretakers, our parents, can either give us an enormous amount of strength and stability, or it can give us challenges that we have to deal with psychologically later in life. And then the third factor is our present environment. What's going on around us right now? Is it stressful? Is it supportive? What kinds of messages are being sent? So, genes play a big role in dopamine, but so does our present environment. There are so many stimuli around us that encourage us to approach life in a dopaminergic way. All of the advertisements that we're exposed to kind of tell us your life isn't good enough right now. You need the product or service that I'm selling in order for it to be okay. So, it's always encouraging us to be dissatisfied with the present moment, looking forward, hopefully, to something better if we buy that thing. Dopamine is responsible for the little hits of excitement we get when we use social media,
Mhm.
whether it's an article that's personally relevant to us that the algorithm has chosen, whether it's a like, whether it's a friend request. And so, to the degree that we engage with social media, our environment is encouraging us to focus on a dopamine approach. So I think that in our modern world, there's a great deal of encouragement to look at the world dopaminergically, but that leads to an unbalanced life. And that's going to lead to unhappiness and falling short of what we're able to accomplish. So I don't believe in dopamine detox, and here's why. Um, the brain and the body change very slowly. And I think we underestimate that because the conscious mind changes very quickly. If you want to know a new fact, you can go look it up on Wikipedia, and now you know it, and now your brain has changed.
Mhm.
But if you want to learn how to throw a baseball, you're going to have to do that 300 times before the brain circuits adapt to allow you to do that. That's your unconscious. That's the more animal side of you, and habits come from the same place. So dopamine detox is like looking up a fact on the internet. All right, for a weekend, I'm going to cut out all the dopamine stuff, and on Monday, I'm going to be refreshed. You might feel a little bit better, you have not brought about long-term changes in your brain that are necessary for something more enduring. So I think slow and steady wins the race. Take a look at how dopamine is influencing your life, how maybe it's leading you around by the nose, and choose something small to change. So if you feel like you're scrolling on social media all night long when you could be interacting with your family, take 30 minutes where you're just going to interact with your family. You're going to put your cell phone down and you're going to learn how hard it is to give somebody your full attention. So I think what you want to do is to make small, sustainable changes for the long term. Because just like learning to drive, learning to throw a baseball, learning to be accustomed to a new way of eating, you got to start small and you've got to do it consistently for a long period of time.
You speak about the control circuit and the desire circuit, and I understand the idea of not going to a dopamine detox because I've heard you speak about this as well, where it's like we think that going away from our phone is completely going away from dopamine. Great, but then when you eat a meal, it's the same thing. And whenever any thing that you get excited about, that anticipation is dopamine, right? It's not achieving the thing; it's right before you achieve it. So, what do you find that I think that's a massive misconception? But is there any other misconceptions that people have about dopamine or how it plays a role?
Yeah. So I think that they really focus on dopamine and pleasure. But
Mhm.
you mentioned that there are more than one circuits in the brain.
Yes.
There's a desire circuit and there's a control circuit. And I think it's worth exploring the control circuit a little bit more because I think that that's less well understood.
Mhm.
The desire circuit is the circuit that gives us motivation. It gives
Mhm.
us excitement. It gives us desire. And it also gives us pleasure as we approach and achieve that goal. And that's evolutionarily brought about to keep us focused on the future, keep us alive and reproducing through sex. That's a very ancient circuit that we share with many, many other animals. But there is a newer circuit that is stronger in human beings than in any other animal. And that is the control circuit that involves the frontal lobes found right behind the forehead. Like the desire circuit, this is about making our future better and more secure. But instead of giving us desire and motivation, it allows us to plan. Um, the desire circuit's impulsive. It sees something, it wants it now. The control circuit thinks farther into the future. And that's what allows humankind to do these amazing things. The future doesn't exist, it's not concrete. And so the control circuit has developed the ability to work with abstractions and hypotheticals. And that leads us to things like mathematics and the laws of science and language, incredibly powerful tools for building a more prosperous future. So the control circuit, when the desire circuit gets out of control, we see things like hedonism and drug abuse and compulsive sexuality. When the control circuit gets out of control, we see people who are type A personalities, workaholics, unable to enjoy the present moment.
That's one thing that I find I've done a little bit of research in this when it comes to the high achievers in life. You even spoke about this in the molecule of more of like geniuses are more likely to be unhappy. Uh,
Yeah.
the high achievers are more likely to be unhappy, even if they're achieving more than everyone else is. And that goes back to the statement earlier. It's like achievements just don't resort to happiness by any means. So for that high achiever, that workaholic, I definitely say my audience definitely leans more towards that. How do we gain more control of our control circuit? And also, just I think it really again goes back to the relationship that we have with dopamine, with ourselves, with achieving, which is just something that none of us really put into perspective nearly enough.
Yeah. Yeah. A very potent dopamine system is fantastic for society because these people create wonderful, wonderful things that enriches everybody.
Yeah.
Maybe not so great for the individual who possesses it.
Mhm.
Yes, they might be rich and famous, but as you mentioned, a lot of them are also miserable. Great artists, great inventors, great musicians, uh, they're often miserable We often see them commit suicide
Yeah.
tragically. Happiness does not come from the dopamine circuits. Happiness comes from the here and now circuits. Um, just being in the present moment with somebody we love, or being lost in the present moment because what we're doing is so interesting. The flow state,
Hmm.
or taking a walk in nature and just seeing that beauty. And I think that one way, a very good way to counteract all of these environmental pressures to live in a dopaminergic state is meditation and mindfulness. It's really about training the brain to be in the present moment. I think of it almost like lifting weights,
Yeah.
um, because it builds up the here and now muscle. And I don't know about you, but like lifting weights for me, it's something I don't want to do. A lot of times I'll be meditating, I'll be like, oh man, this feels so good. But for some reason, when it comes time to sit down for that meditation session, I don't want to do it. And if I have a good excuse to skip it, it makes me happy. So I don't understand why that is, but I think we need to acknowledge it. That it's not some, lovely thing like lying down in a hot bath and being happy. It's hard. It's work. Just like lifting weights is making the body do something it doesn't want to do. The body would prefer to sit on the couch and watch TV. Meditating is making the mind do something it would prefer not to do in order to make it stronger. But just like the result of exercise is good health, the result of meditation is happiness. And not just for you, for the people around you. My kids tell me that they can tell when I'm meditating regularly, and they can tell when I'm blowing it off, because I'm just so much less reactive. I'm so much more mellow, able to be present with them, able to be listen, not to get upset over little things. It's hard. It takes some time to see effects. It's exactly the same as exercise, and it is so worth it.
Yeah. The thing that I think for a lot of, especially again, the type A kind of people, is that it's invisible progress. So when they don't see anything coming from
Yeah.
it, they don't
Yeah.
notice the way that they're responding when they're in traffic or when something messes up throughout the day. They don't see how the response is different, but it's been a transformational experience for me. And I think for a lot of people, something that might even be good is, like you said, going on walks without headphones is so underrated because just being it's like a walking meditation of some sort. Maybe you can't sit down and allow your mind to just stop, but just going out and walking and just being in the moment that you're in, being grounded in that is something we take for granted way too much. Good.
Yeah, that's right. When we're doing that kind of a walk, what we want to do is pay attention to our sensory
Yep.
experiences. If you're listening to music, you're off someplace else. Even if you're not listening to music, the tendency is to let your mind wander,
Hmm.
and just to think about other things. That that's not as good as constantly paying attention to the sounds, the smells, the sights, the feeling of the earth underneath your feet. Sensory experience will anchor you in the present moment.
Yeah, and I think with our phones and the way that society is today, we are out of touch with our bodies. I spoke with a lot of somatic practitioners and therapists on this show, diving into that because I don't think a lot of people are even aware of how that is playing out in their lives. There's something that you look out for when you're working with patients, and it's the if only statements, right?
Mhm.
I'm curious, what else do you look out for so that we can be more aware of the things to look out for that we're putting our happiness off into the future, maybe we're acting out in a way that isn't serving our future self. Like, what are other things that you look out for?
Yeah. So yeah, the if only statement is like, if only I can, have a relationship with this person, I'll be happy.
Yeah.
If only I can get that next promotion, I'll be happy. And we know that that's just not true. I think that other things to look out for are a lack of appreciation of the need and the value of hardship and challenges in our lives. Um, I mentioned earlier that the ancient philosophers said that happiness was the ultimate goal in life. And I think that what's important to realize is that that may be true, but happiness is not something you can pursue directly. You can pursue pleasure, but that's very, very different from happiness. And happiness is something that you need to make yourself to be the kind of person who can experience happiness. And paradoxically, that often involves suffering. Just like muscles need resistance to grow, human beings need adversity and challenges to grow psychologically. Um, as an example of this, you've probably spoken with people who have gone through a battle with cancer, and there are few things worse than that.
Mhm.
The fear of dying, feeling, what are my loved ones going to do without me? Am I letting them down? It's just a horrible, terrible thing. And yet, so many people, after they get through it, say, it transformed my life. It made me take a closer look at the things I was doing, the choices I was making. It made me appreciate the small things. And most importantly of all, it made me appreciate the other people in my life. Another example, studies have shown that couples who do not have children are happier than couples who do. Does that mean we shouldn't have children? Well, couples who do have children face more challenges. They're forced to grow. Some people remain children emotionally their whole lives. If you have children, that's a lot harder to do. You suddenly realize that you have to become an adult. And so maybe without children are happier, but maybe those with children have more meaning in their life. They experience more growth. And what these challenges, what this adversity, the meaning and the growth ultimately lead to is transcendence. And maybe that's ultimately the goal of life, not happiness, but the growth that leads to something we call transcendence.
Mhm. When you think of the word transcendence, because I think what I've continuously tried to come back to is the purpose of life is to enjoy the passage of time. It's not to get to anywhere. It's to enjoy each moment that happens to you, whether that's good, quote unquote, or bad, quote unquote. And I think it's important. What you said when it comes to cancer or just having a near death experience, it's so unfortunate that people have to get to a point where things get so bad that then they decide to make a conscious choice to make the decision to appreciate all the things that do happen. I lost my father, uncle, I lost a lot of family really, really young in my life. And so it kind of instilled into me like, hey, like my father passed at 37, my uncle passed at 37. It's so quick. You absolutely never know. You have to appreciate where you are, whether that's quote unquote again good or bad. I have Amor Fati tattooed on my leg, which is like love your fate, because whatever happens, you can choose the way you react to it or respond to it, appreciate it even. And I think some of the most successful people in life create voluntary suffering in their life because they know that it's going to come their like actual suffering is going to come their way. When you think of transcendence, what does that look like? What does that mean for you?
It sounds like this mystical concept, something that sages and perhaps monks achieve.
Right.
But actually, it's a scientific construct that has been systematically studied. And on average, people become more transcendent as they age. It does not happen to everybody. And I also want to point out that adversity does not always lead to good things. There's a key ingredient, and that is that people need to get through the adversity without feeling crushed by it. If somebody feels that something is more than they're able to resiliently manage, they're not going to grow from it, unfortunately.
Mhm.
So Nietzsche's famous aphorism, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger, is half true. That's only true if you get through it successfully. So if we are able to get through these things successfully, science has shown that we experience what scientists like to call self-transcendence.
Mhm.
Transcendence means to go beyond. Self-transcendence means to go beyond the self. As people achieve this state, they focus less and less on their own needs and the needs of others, and in favor of the needs of others. And this relates to something called the happiness paradox. When we do things to try to make ourselves happy, it usually doesn't lead to happiness. When we do things to make other people happy, it makes us happy. There was a wonderful study that looked at wellness programs in corporate America. I don't know if you're aware of this, but this is like the big thing. Corporate America is burning out its employees. It's not only corporate America's fault. It's of course the pandemic and
Of course.
all of the disruptions going on in our culture. But they want to do these wellness things. So, meditation, mindfulness, yoga, I don't know, tons and tons of other things. Recent study found that none of it worked. None of it reduced burnout except for one thing, and that was volunteer activities. So they put all of these programs in place where people could pursue their own well-being. Didn't lead to it. It was only working for the well-being of other people that decreased burnout and made them happier.
That's profound. I think it's the same reason. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just saying another aspect of transcendence that I think is worth mentioning is not caring as much what other people think about you. When we're young, and it's very hard to put this behind, we're always focused on, oh my God, what are other people thinking? When I was writing these two books, I was writing as if my colleagues were looking over my shoulder. I wanted to write this in a way that non-specialists could understand, but I was terrified that if I oversimplified it, my colleagues would criticize me. In fact, only one guy did it, and so I totally worried needlessly. It's kind of like, you go to a party and you get a stain on your shirt and you're absolutely mortified. And later it turns out nobody noticed it.
No.
Nobody knew it was there. So part of self-transcendence is this insight or this, or not even an insight, just you just don't care so much anymore. And it really leads to a sense of freedom.
I think it's the same reason that, like you said earlier, it's not for everybody, but for most people, the older you get, the less detached or less attachment you have to other people's opinions. I think one of the best things that you can do is just not. I think you can get really comfortable being misunderstood by other people, because if they didn't go through your experience, they didn't grow up in the way that you grew up, they didn't have to make the decisions, the choices that you had to make. How can anyone ever judge someone from a perspective that they've never been a part of? And
Yeah.
it's so important to understand that. When I first got into creating content and doing this podcast, all I thought about was other people's opinions. And 230 episodes in, I could care less. I love this to death, and it excites me so much. And it's just something, like you said, if we're of service to other people, we're not even thinking about ourselves. What I was going to say is the same reason Tony Robbins is able to be on stage for 12 hours straight is because he's being of service to other people. If that didn't involve service, I bet he wouldn't be on there for 3 hours, because it's the same thing. We gain so much from it. I think it was. Go ahead.
We spend so much time focusing on ourselves.
Yeah.
What's going to make me happy? What do I need? What's next? What do other people think of me? But it's when we completely forget about ourselves that we're experiencing peak life. So that flow state, when you are totally absorbed, you're completely unaware of yourself. You're 100% focused on the work. And in some ways, that's the most enjoyable thing. When you're making somebody else happy, those are peak experiences. And we forget that.
Yeah, we don't give enough emphasis to it. It's all of the external things that we can see. It's like metrics, right? So if you have a YouTube channel, or if you have some kind of goal that you're trying to move towards, a sport, there's stuff in Spellbound that talks about it as well, with the superstitions and everything. If we are so focused on the external things that have markers to it, of course it's easy to attach our self-worth to that. But it's common that the things that actually bring us happiness and fulfillment and joy are the things that we can't see, that there
Yeah.
is no metric to. And it's so important to talk on that. There's from Spellbound, I think the common thread is that the purpose of life is to become a whole person. What does that mean?
Yeah, it's to forge this friendly, productive working relationship between the conscious and the unconscious.
Mhm.
Rational consciousness is one-sided. It's unbalanced. It is a bloodless calculating machine. The unconscious is primitive. It's wild. It's instinctual. It can be destructive and out of control. It's only by bringing the two together, like a rider and a horse working as a team, or a hunter and a dog working together as a team, the rational human and the instinctual animal. That's what it means to become whole, and that's a very powerful combination.
It absolutely is. One thing that I love to ask authors, especially that have wrote multiple books, is that I find that the book that teaches you the most isn't the one that you read, but it's the one that you write. At least that's what I've heard from a few authors that I know. So from the books that you've written, what book has taught you the most about yourself? What have you learned about yourself through that process? Because to say the least, it is absurd the amount of effort and work and just dedication it takes to write a book to begin with. But I know that you learn a lot about yourself in the process.
Yeah. It is so funny that you mentioned that. My wife and I were just talking about that last night. It's a weird Jungian synchronicity.
Yeah, yeah,
But it was definitely Spellbound. We were talking about that. The material in Spellbound is challenging.
yeah,
It's not easy material, and it can be a little bit intimidating too, because it's asking people to confront things about themselves that perhaps they have been using a lot of energy to avoid confronting.
yeah,
Um, my wife and I were talking about how we really hoped people would read this, that it could make an impact on people's lives. And she said, yeah, but even if nobody reads it, it changed you so much
yeah.
writing that book. And I learned so much about myself, grappling with these ideas and struggling to explain them in an understandable way. A lot of times the things that we're expert in, we think we understand. But then when we try to explain them to someone else, we realize, geez, I don't understand this at all.
Uh huh.
So I had many, many lovely, enjoyable hours discovering the gaps in my knowledge in this area, and filling in those gaps with lots of fascinating reading.
Yeah, it's the more that you come to know about something, the more that you realize you know absolutely nothing. How
Yeah.
expansive this world is, the more that you get into it. And I can only imagine from your perspective, like published so many papers and just have dove in so deep into this work. What from Spellbound do you think that people misunderstand? Because you're right. I think the where growth comes from is confrontation. When we're able, the catalyst to growth is confrontation. When we're able to confront the things that we are usually blind to because it's just the way that we live life. So what were some of those things that you noticed?
I think that it's important that people understand that agents within the unconscious have goals, and
Mm,
that these goals are not going to be the same as your conscious goals. And so, if you don't have a good relationship with them, you will end up sabotaging yourself. And we've all had that experience. Jung says that the unconscious mind delights in the most mischievous things. I've had the experience of like introducing somebody that you've known for years and years and years and years, and you completely blank on their name, and you're
yeah.
absolutely mortified, right? Or you're coming in late for some meeting, and you're trying to be real careful, and you kick the chair in the loudest way possible in a way that you're usually not that clumsy. The unconscious mind can screw you up. It can also, though, be an unbelievable ally, giving you inspiration, giving you the energy to do things you never thought was possible. I look back on things I've done in the past and I think, oh my God, how did I pull that off? I could never do something like that again. And when I say I could never pull it off, that's the conscious mind speaking,
Yep.
and that is true. The conscious mind doesn't have the energy, the inspiration, the intuition. It needs the help of its partner, but we need to appreciate that the goals may not be aligned,
Mhm.
and that we need to be the leader of this partnership, just like the rider needs to be the leader of the horse. But we also need to understand the horse's motivations and work with that, and not be a tyrant, but be an enlightened trainer that treats it with gentleness and consistency.
This is a topic I absolutely love touching on. This is something that I work with clients on often, is that there's this push and pull to things that we say we want to achieve a goal of doing whatever it may be on the external, but then we have an internal goal that's really pushing us to do the exact opposite, whether it's
Mm.
fear of failure, fear of judgment from others. There's fear of success that a lot of people are unaware of. There's so many fears that we have that hold us back from taking the action to achieve the goal. So how do we kind of get more in alignment with those two?
So these are instinctual forces,
Yep.
and instinctual forces must be expressed.
Mhm.
Let's look at some very simple instinctual forces: hunger, thirst, the need to go to the bathroom. They must be expressed. Animals express instinctual forces in one way, and that is through behavior.
Mhm.
But what's amazing about human beings is that we have a second way to experience them, and that is through awareness. And so by allowing these unconscious forces, these instinctual forces to occupy our awareness, we don't have to act on them. It's when we deprive them of awareness by disavowing them, saying, nope, nope, there's some guy cuts me off in traffic
Hmm.
and I want to punch him in the face. No, 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 no. I'm a good person. I don't punch people in the face. I don't express my frustration by inflicting pain on other people. And it's true, I don't, but like every other human being on the planet, I want to.
Yeah.
And we need to accept and be aware of that, because if we allow it to occupy our awareness, that drains the instinct of its energy. It does its thing. It says, thank you very much, that's what I needed, now go about the rest of your day. If, on the other hand, you suppress it and you say, no, 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 I would never be that kind of a person, it's going to come out in some
Yeah.
other way, maybe through an insensitive comment. We've also said, oh my God, where did that come from? Well, it came from you denying your sadistic impulses access to awareness. Let yourself experience the feeling, then you won't have to act on it.
We want to deny our shadow, but once we actually
Yeah.
accept it and see it for what it is, that's when it dissipates a little bit. That's when we gain a little bit more control.
And it can become an ally. The shadow can be transformed into something very strong that gives us inner strength and capabilities we didn't know we had.
Yeah, there's one thing from Spellbound that I think I want to dive in a little bit because I haven't touched on it yet is the superstitions kind of thing.
Mm,
Whether it's Michael Jordan or it's any Tom Brady, there's so many different examples of this where I think a lot of people in sports, I grew up playing baseball, huge, massive. So many people in baseball are the similar way. Why
yeah.
do you think that people have so much pushback against the metaphysical or the spiritual aspect of things, but yet we do things that are contradictory towards the pushing against it?
Yeah, that's right. I use the example of superstition because I wanted to bring my 21st century reader, who thinks that they are rational creatures and don't believe in magic,
Yep.
to reality. Yes, you do believe in magic. You just don't think you do. So superstition is an example. Um, but let me give you an example of how I think that you believe in magic in spite of thinking that you're rational. Imagine that you checked into a hotel and the desk clerk put you in a room where somebody had been murdered the previous week. And the desk clerk said, don't worry, room's been cleaned, it's been sterilized. You'll never, ever know. There's no way to tell. Fresh sheets on the bed, no problem. How are you going to feel sleeping in that room where someone murdered?
I'm
Well,
not.
rationally, there's no reason. It's just like the room next door or the room in another hotel. Um, but because of evolution, because of genetics, because of the way our brain is wired, we can't avoid believing in magic. And so we don't have to say it's true, but we have to say that our belief is real and that comes from a place that's true, and we have to work with it. We tend to be most superstitious in situations where the stakes are high and our control is low. So, for example, people aren't going on a first date, people going to a job interview are more likely to wear a lucky shirt, a lucky tie, carry a lucky charm.
Mhm.
Uh, and then professional athletes are far more superstitious than the general population because for them, on a daily basis, the stakes are incredibly high and they don't have control. They can practice all they want, they can improve their skills, but some days they're on and some days they're not. Some days they're giving an inspired performance, other days they're an absolute mess. And that's the unconscious. That's the unconscious, sometimes cooperating, sometimes not cooperating. And because we experience subjectively the unconscious as a supernatural force,
Mhm.
that leads us to superstitions. And actually, superstitions do work. They help us perform better. There was this wonderful study where they had volunteers make putts. And half the volunteers were handed a ball and they said, hey, just want to let you know this is a lucky ball. Everybody's doing good with this ball these days. And other ones were handed the exact same ball and told this is the ball everyone's using. And the ones who were told it was a lucky ball sunk more putts.
Mhm.
So it does make sense to some degree, accept that part of our brains, at least, do process information about the world in magical terms, and we can boost our performance by accepting that and working with it.
I again love this topic. I'm not sure if you know who Derek Sivers is, but great author. We spoke a few months ago, and he's writing a book right now called "Useful Not True," which is essentially the mindset
That's
that
great.
we take on beliefs that are useful for us. Say you're not a confident person, but then you take on the belief that I'm a confident person. It may not be true, but it can be useful for you. And if
Yeah.
it's useful for you, it eventually will become true. And so it's like the same kind of perspective here where maybe we don't want to believe it's true, but if we take on the belief that it is, it probably will be used to our benefit, which is so I'm fascinated by this kind of work and I love that you talk on it.
And I could imagine people pushing back on that and saying,
Yeah.
no, 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 I want what's true. But we have to do that. For example, let's take my desk. I act as if my desk were solid.
Mhm.
Now, rationally, I know it's not. Rationally, I know it's more than 99% empty space, based on my high school chemistry learning about the atom. But it would be extremely unuseful for me to go through life trying to see things as being 99% empty space. And that's because I was given a very particular kind of brain. And it's a brain that evolved under circumstances in which viewing solid pieces of wood as solid is the best way to stay alive and reproduce. And it's true with supernatural ideas. They may not be true, but tough luck. Evolution gave you a particular kind of brain, and you can't change it.
You can't, and you often don't have much control over it either, as you
Yeah.
state. When it comes to the unconscious, it drives our behavior, it drives our beliefs. A lot of this work, I think it's people have so much pushback to it, is simply because they're unaware of the belief that it is. Like I think when I got into this space, the reason this podcast is a You Can Too podcast was really because a lot of people have this belief that they can't do X. And if you don't believe you can do something, your behavior is going to reflect that. That's going to be your life. And it's going to
Yeah.
reinforce the belief. And it's just a cycle that so many of us get caught up in. So if we're unconscious to these beliefs that we have in our life that hold us back from achieving whatever it may be, how do we build a better relationship or even come to the awareness that it is a belief? It's not fact.
Hmm. Uh, yeah. So I think that beliefs come from the unconscious,
Mhm.
and understanding facts come from the conscious. Um,
Mhm.
and we've got to somehow find a way to bring those two things together.
Yeah.
And it's very, very difficult. So I think that we have to be open to our unconscious beliefs. We have to sensitize ourselves to becoming aware of what it is that our unconscious is doing, what kinds of things it's believing, and then we need to test them with conscious rationality. So I think it's a two-part kind of thing, and then we have both sides of the equation, and then we can make a decision. Am I going to act on the irrational belief? Sometimes that's better.
Yeah.
Or am I going to just be aware of those drives, not act on them, and make myself act on the rational thing? So again, road rage accident. I
Yeah.
may believe that the best possible thing in the world is to throw that punch. But I better test that rationally. I better engage in a little mental time travel. What's going to happen 2 hours later after I throw that punch and I'm being booked at the police department? So I think we need to do both, and we need to try to find some way of bringing them together.
Yeah, and that's spellbound, right? Is being able to work with both of them. I think you're right. A lot of the people with mental illness or anyone that struggles with this thinks as though the action that they're doing is rational, regardless of if it is or it isn't. So
Yeah.
being able to really take inventory of that is so, so important.
A lot of what the rational mind does is it justifies the things that we do instinctually.
Yep.
So studies have shown that when you go to buy like an appliance, like a refrigerator, you decide based on a gut feeling. But we like to think of ourselves as rational, and so we come up with reasons. Well, it's got an ice maker. Consumer Reports gave it a high rating. So we probably allowing our unconscious to make more decisions than we're aware of, and the conscious mind is sort of backfilling in. So it can feel like it's actually in the driver's seat. Most of the time, it's not.
95% of the time it's not. And that's why it's
Yeah.
so important to come to that, because a lot of people are just walking through life. I like to use the word coasting because it's the only way I can frame it in such a way that they're coasting through life, just acting as though this is how life is supposed to be. This is how I'm supposed to be. And just not being able to understand how much of a role our unconscious plays in our lives. And I think it's so important and makes sense why it was the more transformational kind of book, because this is the foundation of what life is. If we're unaware of this kind of stuff, we can't take that gap. We don't have any ability to respond in such a way. We're just reacting. It's so powerful. Dan, thank you so much for coming on the show. There's one last question I ask every guest, encapsulates what I want to do with this podcast. My question for you is, what belief are you currently unlearning?
Um, that's a okay. So the belief I'm currently unlearning is that other people are like me. One of the things writing this book I realized is just how differently people see the world, and that sounds kind of trite, but I think that it is so profound that it's led me to the conclusion that in some ways, much of what I think I'm communicating to other people is being heard in a completely different way than I think. And just trying to have a little bit of humility and just understanding how radically different people see the world.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big reason I do this podcast, to take different angles and different perspectives from people. Thank you again for so much for coming on the show. I know you're not too much on socials, but everything, LinkedIn and everything, will be in the show notes below. Is there anywhere you'd like to direct people or anything that you have going on?
Not right now. My co-author Mike Long is working on the sequel to this. I helped him out with some of the research. I think it's going to be fantastic, and I'm hopefully going to have another book out myself within a couple of years.
Well, you'll be back on when it does.
Thank you.
Thank you.